psychology.
6 years that's been on my phone. 6. Long time to wait. So why are we back? Well, because some people said, would you please help me out with one of the core studies? And I said, which ones do we hate the most? And they said, these. So I said, okay, I hate Moray, but that's slightly smaller, and I like Gould. So let's do one on Gould. I think the first question is, why do people have a problem with Gould? Because I think it's pretty straightforward, but I think the question is, Gould tends to draw of Yerkes. So when you're asked a question, is it Gould or is it Yerkes? And that's confusing. It's quite simple. If Yerkes did it, Gould's talking about Yerkes, so it's in Gould. If you ask the question, why is Gould an individual differences study? And the answer is, the key concept is that we can test and quantify individual characteristics. One characteristic is intelligence. This was tested for and quantified in Gould's study, who described how Yerkes tested it using the Army Alpha, Beta, and individual tests. And everybody got different scores. So you can say what Yerkes did in Gould, easy peasy lemon squeeze. The background then pretty straightforward. There are lots of intelligence theories. Psychologists are focused on measuring it instead of trying to decide what it is. Boring, who's a chum of Yerkes, said intelligence is what intelligence tests. What do you need to know about Yerkes? Well, you need to know he's a psychologist at Harvard University. He was keen that psychology should be considered scientific, that intelligence was genetically orientated, and that it could be measured with rigour. And he saw the ideal opportunity to do this with 1.7 million recruits in the First World War. What do you need to know about Gould? Well, he wanted to show that there were problems with intelligence testing, in particular, the beliefs about intelligence being inherited and society being prejudiced because of this has led to the objectivity of measurements being distorted. In other words, that the tests were biased and that results and conclusions that were drawn from them in the past are not to be trusted. So now the easy bit, the story of what Gould did. He tested 1.7 million Army recruits for intelligence. He had 3 types of tests. The Army Alpha test, which had questions like Washington is to Adams as first is to. Crisco is a patient, a disinfectant, a toothpaste, or a food product. The number of Kaffir's legs is 2, 4, 6, or 8. Christy Mathewson is as a writer, artist, baseball player, comedian. Now, most of us don't know the answer to those now because they're rooted in the past or they're culturally different. But if you wanted to know, they're on your screens now. So then, for those who were illiterate candidates or failures of the alpha test, there was the beta test, which had a bunch of pictures, such as a light bulb without a filament. While I show this in class now, most people don't know what's missing because nobody uses light bulbs with filaments anymore, so that question's kind of dead again. A tennis court without a net, an addressed envelope without the stamp, and a 10-pin bowling court without the ball. And if that was failed, recruits should have been called for an individual spoken assessment, but that rarely happened. So, what did Gould have to say? Gould, in essence, really had 3 things to say about this. One, the content of the test was massively socially biased. So, if you're familiar with white American culture, you would have done much better than if you weren't familiar with white American culture. 2, there are far more illiterate soldiers than people thought, which meant that there were far too many people needed the beta test, so they just fired them into the alpha test, whether they were literate or not. People were rarely called back for the beta test, almost never called back for an individual test, and the people that were the administrator hit the worst were the black Americans because of the nature of society at that time. So Yerkes, the big dunderhead, thought he'd successfully measured intelligence, and he came up with the following conclusions. This is the reason that Gould exists, because he was pointing out that these conclusions were wrong. Wrong conclusion number 1, that the average mental age of a white American was just over 13, touch above being a moron. Previously, it thought that there was a mighty 16 years of age. 2, that it was poor immigrants, black people, into breeding that was lowering that mental age. 3, that you could judge people's mental age by their skin color, and the darker the color, the lower the mental age. And 4, the lowest mental age of the 4 groups of white Americans, Western Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and black Americans was black American at 10.41 years of age. Clearly, all those conclusions were incorrect due to the nature of the testing, but that did not stop the historical consequences. Was that this was partly used to help the Senate pass a law in 1924 restricting immigration. That immigration restriction led to about 6 million people being denied access to America over the next 15 years, which of course brings us to 1939, the start of the Second World War. And 6 million is a significant figure because that was the number of Jewish people that were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust that may have been able to escape had that law not been passed. So the consequences were really far-reaching.
And that's why Gould is great, because he teaches us how terrible Yerkes was. And this is not embarrassingly overdubbed because I got the names mixed up in the first place.
Some revision tasks for you to do. Answer these questions and you got it nailed. Good luck. Bye for now.